In this video, we're going to create a menu and add it to the Mod Manager's configuration menu, which can be brought up with LB and X. I want to let people configure things like how long our summons last, their damage and speed multipliers, and maybe even which NPCs are spawned. To get started, I'm going to create a new file in our mods folder. You don't need to do this, but it's much cleaner to separate your MCM code from your main script. I like to call this orcs, but I'll call it MCM for clarity. In our mod manifest, I'm going to add this file to the files list. Now I'll reinstall the mod through the mod manager. Let's open the file we made. This is going to contain our menu's buttons. A menu is pretty much just a collection of buttons with functions attached to those buttons. A button can also lead to other collections of buttons, i.e. opening a menu. To create a button, we call a function named mcm.newActionEntry. It's got a stupid name, but it basically means button. We can pass this 4 things. The first is the text to be displayed on the button. The second is a bool or function that determines whether the button is enabled. If this is a function, it's called when the menu is opened, and it should return a bool. The third is the function that should be called when your button is pressed. The fourth is the optional argument to pass to the function. To pass multiple arguments, simply nest them within a table. If you want to pass a table, nest the table in another table. I should probably make it so that you can just pass unlimited arguments, but whatever. NewActionEntry will return our button. A menu is simply a table containing as many buttons as we want, like so. The MCM will split your table up into multiple pages, which can be navigated by pressing B. Now, this table actually needs to be returned by a function. By putting our table into a function that defines and returns it each time it's called, our menu essentially updates and we can dynamically reevaluate things about our buttons. For example, if we want the in-game time to be in the button's text, we can simply call timing.getTimeOfDay in the first argument. If our table wasn't redefined by the function, getTimeOfDay would be called immediately when the script is run, and it would just contain the time of day it was when the mod was installed, and never change. Now we have a function that returns our menu, but how do we add it to the MCM? Okay, this might get a little confusing. We're not going to directly add our entire menu to the MCM. Instead, we're going to create and add a single button that opens our menu to the MCM. This button will be inserted onto the MCM's main menu. Let's create this button. So if this button is going to open our menu, how do we do that? We set mcm.openMenu as our button's function. Remember, we don't want to call this function. Just reference it as the third argument and it will be called when the button is pressed. We need to pass this function 2 things, so the fourth argument should be a table. The first thing in the table, that is the first argument that OpenMenu will receive, is the title of the menu, which is displayed at the top of the window. The second thing is the function that returns our menu table. Once again, we don't want to call this function, we just want to reference it. In summary, when we push this button, the MCM will call OpenMenu and pass it the title and the function that returns our menu. Okay, we now have a button that opens our menu, but now we actually need to add this button to the MCM. To do this, we define a specific function called getMCMEntry. This will automatically be called by the mod manager once the mod is installed, so you don't need to call it yourself at any point. This function must return 2 things: our button that will open our main menu, which we just created, and a key. This key can be anything. It's simply used by the mod manager to remove our button from the MCM when we uninstall. I tend to set it to the mod's name ID, and I suggest you do too. Okay, let me show you how to create a submenu. It's very simple. To make another menu, we can duplicate the get main MCM entries and modify the buttons to do whatever. Then to open this menu, we can just copy the button we return from getMCMEntry and add it to the main menu. Change the args to reference our submenu. Now this button that's in the main menu will open our submenu. Now we're done with the code, but this script doesn't automatically get run. We need to run it ourselves from our starting script. This is easy. Just open your start script and call modmisc.loadModFile and pass it the file path relative to your mods folder. The script I just made is mcm.lua, so I'll just pass it mcm.lua. The return value is the script in the format of a function. Simply call the return value and all code within will be run as if it were in the script, though without access to its locals. The manager will figure out which mod we're calling from by reading the _nameID variable that is automatically created in our environment. If you ever need to load a script from a custom environment, pass the function your mod's nameID as the second argument. Okay, now we have our menu structure, but these buttons don't do anything useful. The MCM provides a function called setValue, which is literally just setting a value in a table. I'm going to add a bool now and a condition to the debug text so we can toggle it on and off when the bool changes, that is, when the button is pressed. In my MCM script, I'll add a button to toggle it. We'll reference mcm.setValue and pass it 3 arguments. Remember that multiple arguments must be nested within a table. arg1 is the table that the value resides in. Since this script is in the same environment as the value we want to modify, we can just pass it getFN for 1. arg2 is the key. The bool's key is debugging, so I'll just pass it a string containing debugging. arg3 is the value. To toggle the bool, we can just type not debugging. Let's try that. Okay, and it didn't work because it can't find the MCM script. Another manager bug. Back in a second. Fixed it. The manager was saving before modifying the directory manifest. Nice. We've just made a menu, some buttons, and a sub-menu that contains a button that actually does something. Now I want to let the user choose a duration for how long the summons last. I'll obviously change this later so it's a base duration plus an amount per level, but this is just an example. I'm going to create a function in the MCM script that will ask the user for an amount, then set the value. In this, we're going to use a function called GUI.askForAmount. This is the same menu that's used for donating at the Temple of Light. AskForAmount takes quite a few arguments, but thankfully they're self-explanatory. I'm just going to copy another use of the function call and modify it. Now's the perfect time to mention the first come first serve message table, which is extremely important. GUI functions often work based off of messages, and as such you're liable to receive the same message multiple times unless you handle the message ID. The askForAmount function is given a table as its first argument, and it handles the IDs for you. However, you do not want to pass it your own table. Instead, you want to pass it the mod manager's first come first serve table. This basically stops your mod and other mods from receiving each other's messages. If I went into your MCM and used the askForAmount menu, then went into another mod and used their askForAmount menu, and you didn't share IDs, the second mod would pick up your mod's message. By using the first come first serve table, you can share IDs so you don't conflict. The first come first serve table is accessed with modmisc.fcfs messages, so I'll pass that as the first argument. Type will be eAdjusterTypes.adjusterTypeMoney. Min value will be 5, max will be 60. Increment will be 1, as it will be 1 second per unit, meaning at 60, 1 minute. Default will be 12. ShowSign will be false. GUI donate gold is the text tag, which we can replace with our own text. Last argument is... I'm not actually sure. I usually just pass it 1. By the way, askForAmount returns an unsigned integer. If you make minval negative and the user chooses such a value, you'll get the max 32-bit unsigned int value, minus whatever the user chose. You can fix this with ease by performing a little bit of math on the returned value. askForAmount returns 2 things, the chosen value, and whether the user accepted it with A or closed it with B. Let's test this. This time it worked, but remember, the GUI might not pop up until we close the menu. The remedy is simple, we'll just introduce a half-second yield to the function so that the menu animation plays out. There we go. We can now configure the duration. If I make options for which creatures are spawned at each tier, there's a bunch of ways I could do it. I could create a button for each tier that reuses the same menu that displays a list of creatures. I could even just make a button for each tier and have them call askForAmount. Each number would correspond to a different creature, though I have tested this and you can't fit more than 6 lines of text on one askForAmount menu anyway. But before I create the menu, I'll create the code. Firstly, I'll create a list of creatures. I won't assign any keys to them, as the table will only be used to iterate over. I'll also create a table which remembers which creatures are selected for each tier. At index 1, spell level 1, index 2, spell level 2, and so on. By default, tier 1 will be whatever is in the first position of the creature enum. I'm now going to implement the spell tier detection, and then spawn that tier's creature. When we detect the hero casting the spell, I'll immediately store the cast level in a public variable, so we don't have to get it again a couple seconds later when it's time to actually spawn the creatures, as the player could cast another spell during those 2 seconds and mess up the reading. I'll need to use math.max on last spell level, as quick casting sets it to -1. I'll also then add 1 to it, as it seems to start at 0. Casting level 5 returns 4. Let's test this now. Oops, this little guy is spawning because I forgot to actually add the extra time to the spell delay, the issue that I technically didn't fix in the last episode but I pointed it out. But other than that, it looks good. Now we have the ability to spawn creatures depending on spell level. Let's finally create a submenu for choosing creatures. This is definitely going to get confusing because I'm doing some fancy stuff. I recommend you only try something like this if you have a good understanding of the MCM. Let me briefly mention that the OpenMenu function actually returns which action entry was chosen. This means that if our function calls OpenMenu, we can see what the user chose. This lets us reverse the delegation of what the button does from the MCM to our own function. This means we can have one function that opens the menu and acts based on which entry was chosen, rather than having each entry act on its own. OpenMenu also has a third optional argument, a bool, that immediately closes the menu whenever the player chooses an option, rather than reopening and letting them choose again. I want to do this because I don't want 5 entire menus for 5 tiers, which would all contain identical options that do the same thing, except with a different number. Instead, I'm going to dynamically create a menu, which is reused for all 5 tiers. First, I'll create a menu by iterating over our enum and creating a button for each creature. I don't want the buttons in our dynamically created menu to actually do anything. Instead, I want the function that opened this menu to act based on the chosen action entry. Because of this, I'll just create an anonymous stub function for the buttons to call. The button is also going to store its creature index in its argument. Our function that's going to call OpenMenu is going to receive and be able to read the properties of this button. This means the function can index the arg value of the button to receive which creature was stored in it. So, instead of having a button that directly calls OpenMenu and calls the function of whichever button was chosen from the menu, we have a button that calls our function which calls OpenMenu and handles the entry itself. This function will be passed the tier we want to modify. It will then call OpenMenu itself and pass it the creature list menu. It will then receive which creature's button was chosen and reads its arg value straight from the action entry. You can now set the selected creature's value at the index of the tier argument to the value in the pressed button's arg property. Okay, we've set up the reusable creature menu containing stub functions and the open function that opens said menu, then handles the chosen option. Now we create the menu where you choose the tier. This menu is going to contain buttons that call our open function and pass it the tier to modify like so. This is just an ordinary menu. Our open function is going to be the function, and the tier to modify is going to be the arg. Let's test this. Oops, simple mistake. Forgot to actually add the dynamically created buttons to the menu. I also forgot that the user can choose none of the buttons, so it's indexing nothing if the user chose to leave the menu like I just did. Okay, let's try again. Great. This is all looking a lot better than it was when it was just a function in Runtime Code Loader. There's not actually that much more I want to add to the MCM. I know I said I'd let the player configure things like the timers, but for the sake of the tutorial, I think you can understand how to do that. In the next video, I'll cover the update system so your mod can update.